This is on asexuality through promiscuity, some morphological and reproductive strategies employed by flowering plants. When it comes to a plant's sex life and its partners, it pretty much covers the whole spectrum of possibilities. Plants don't read the books or the papers, and so they frequently don't follow the characteristics that are laid out. This talk is going to be generalizations of some of the morphological traits and strategies common to the seed production in a number of our more common native plants. While I was interested in plants from a very young age, after purchasing a home, that really sparked my interest. And the land was probably more important to me than the actual house. I started acting on that interest, and one of the first plants I purchased was a Jacob's Ladder plant. It bloomed beautifully and I wanted more, but budget was tight. I kept waiting for it to seed out. Several years passed by, no babies. Eventually I purchased another plant, and now I have babies which I can share with other gardeners. I learned that the flowers of Jacob's Ladder have actually 3 different things that make it hard for them to produce viable seed. One is self-incompatibility, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But then the anthers, which is the pollen-bearing part of the flower, mature and produce pollen before the stigmas, which is the female part of the flower, become receptive. The plants using this strategy are called protandrous. Finally, the stigma also extends beyond the anthers, those pollen-bearing structures, making it difficult for self-pollination. So insects have to be relied upon to pollinate the plants. Any of these 3 things or in combination might be why my Jacob's Ladder did not produce seeds. If you want seeds, you need to acquire 2 or more plants. If you're interested in native plants and want them to produce seed, this is very important. I recommend that you usually look for plants grown from seed. Many plants in the trade are produced through tissue culture or division. This provides lots of plants that look just alike, which might be great for a certain kind of visual effect. But what happens when an environmental disaster comes through or disease hits? All of the plants that you have are going to have the same response. If that is to die, you're going to have denuded places in your landscape, or the critters that depend on your plants will be harmed and maybe die. Okay, I already mentioned the protandrous nature of Jacob's Ladder and 2 other morphological traits of those plants. But the first reproductive strategy I want to really consider is Apomixis. Plants using this produce seed, but they do so asexually. There's no fertilization involved. There are a number of ways in which this can happen. It involves the chromosomes of diploid somatic cells. It's complicated, and I'm not going to go into it here. Its occurrence is generally widespread in nature, but infrequent. Most known Apomixis occurs in the Rosaceae, Poaceae, and Asteraceae families. In the Rosaceae family, it includes Amelanchiers, Aronias, Sorbus, and Rubus species. In the Asteraceae family genera, including 2 of the genera, including species of hawkweeds and dandelions, are apomictic. And I just discovered that some orchids and citrus reproduction is also done using Apomixis. Big Ag is very interested in Apomixis. They want to create crop plants that will be clones from seed to get rid of variability. They are especially interested in creating tuber crops using Apomixis. Planting true breeding seeds with this strategy of reproduction would have many advantages. Seeds would reduce the propagation and spread of diseases and viruses, which happen with tubers a lot. In addition, asexual propagation would greatly reduce the volume, storage, shipping, and planting costs of tubers. But what happens again if a major novel virus or fungus or other disease comes through? I hope that the people in power will maintain multiple apomictic strains and natural strains of any crops they produce so that an entire species can't be made extinct when something happens. Anyway, if plants can reproduce asexually via bulbs, rhizomes, and more, plus apomixis, why have those pesky males with all that allergy-causing pollen around? Are apomictic plants prudes or narcissists? And that's a tongue twister for me. Sorry about that. The most common bloom structure in plants are hermaphroditic flowers. These flowers have both male and female parts. Cross-pollination, on the whole, is considered the best for a plant species to maintain its viability, but there can be problems with cross-pollination as well. If you collect seeds from a single population or from widely separated populations, you might either end up with inbreeding or outbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is when genetically similar individuals cross with each other, and it results often in a reduction in fitness of the offspring. If you think about the old taboos, they used to say, oh, you shouldn't marry first cousins. Well, it's kind of the same thing with the plants. Outbreeding depression is when very genetically different individuals cross and produce offspring. Again, they are probably not as fit as the original plants. This is the outbreeding depression is probably mostly important to plant conservationists who manage large tracts of native species or who are trying to reestablish a species in an area from which it's been exterminated. They need to carefully consider their sources for the reintroduced plants or the seed. Now to incompatibility. This is the largest section of the program. There are a fair number of common garden plants that do not produce or infrequently produce viable seed on their own. When we say they are usually self-incompatible, that means that they cannot be fertilized by their own pollen or by a close genetic relative. In a survey of the breeding systems of 571 species in the Asteraceae family, the majority of plants are self-incompatible. Of that 571 species, 63%, or about 360 of those species surveyed, were incompatible. Another 10% are partially self-incompatible, and 27% were self-compatible. Self-incompatibility appears to be an older trait, and through time, plants that were self-incompatible have become partially self-incompatible or self-compatible. But there's evidence that this can reverse so that a plant which is now self-compatible might at some point in the future become self-incompatible. There are at least 5 types of self-incompatibility. In all cases, the pollen grain is prevented from reaching the ovary, or the gametes are prevented from fusing. In many cases, a flower has control over what sperm from a pollen grain it will accept. The pollen grain lands on the stigma and begins its trip through the style. But the pollen and the plant begin communicating with each other, exchanging genetic information. The plant also begins creating a toxin. If the pollen is from a different species or a close relative, the toxin may be released and the pollen tube growth towards the ovary is stopped. This requires understanding of molecular mechanisms and is above my mental capacity, so I'm not going to attempt to go into it here. But if a species you wish to have in your garden is self-incompatible, you should consider obtaining at least 3 individuals of that species that were grown from seed. The following first group of slides are of species that are self-incompatible or partially self-incompatible and thus require cross-pollination. The cause of this self-incompatibility varies with species and in some cases is unknown. As I mentioned, I don't know enough about the different causes, and so I'm not going to mention them. The first plant, though, that we're going to look at is black cohosh or black baneberry, which is self-incompatible. 2 wind-pollinated plants, blue stem or turkey foot, and then Indian grass are both self-incompatible. Hemp dogbane needs pollination most of the time. It also spreads widely by rhizomes, so you might think that it's produced fertile seed and it's growing everywhere, but it's probably just spreading by rhizomes. Milkweeds have different things, and if you'll notice at the top, there's an SC, SI, SISC. That stands for self-compatible and self-incompatible. The slash shows the main way that that particular species, whether it's compatible or self-incompatible. If it's the uppercase letters and it's SI, it is self-incompatible for the most part, may have some self-compatibility. So sometimes a self-incompatible milkweed will produce some seed, but from my personal experience, the seed may not fully develop. You need to have enough individual plants so that multiple plants are blooming at the same time to allow for cross-pollination. I have this problem with my Asclepias tuberosa a lot, where, you know, I'll say, oh, it's got 3 seed pods on it. Well, one will maybe mature and produce mature seeds, but the others, I mean, it's not because it's too late in the season, but it just doesn't produce them. And I think it's because there are no other plants blooming at the same time as those other flowers on the Asclepias tuberosa. Over the years, I've had a lot of people complain to me that their pawpaws don't produce fruit. In addition to being self-incompatible, pawpaws have another difficulty with fertilization of its flowers. The flowers are perfect. They have both male and female parts, but they also are protogynous, meaning that the female stigma matures and is no longer receptive when the male pollen is shed. This is sort of the opposite of what happened with my Jacob's ladder plant. So whether the male parts mature first or the female parts, in both cases, you need to have multiple plants. And if they're self-incompatible, those plants need to be from different parents, different genetics. Marsh marigold is another self-incompatible species. And apparently, Caltha and Ranunculus are the 2 genera within Runculaceae that have some incompatible species. Now I'm going to go off topic for a second because there is a marsh marigold, somewhat look-alike, that is so very, very, very invasive. It apparently has no characteristics hindering its reproduction. In fact, it has 3 means of reproduction. Please be very careful of species when you obtain marsh marigold. The invasive species, the Ficaria verna, fig buttercup, is often confused with the very beautiful and respectable marsh marigold species. Buttonbush will have no problem attracting pollinators, but its self-incompatibility, protandry, and a third strategy called secondary pollen presentation might prevent offspring, even with that huge number of pollinator visits. In secondary pollen presentation, when the female style is elongating, it touches the anthers and carries pollen with it, but the female stigma isn't yet receptive. So most of the pollen is just tossed away or eliminated. It doesn't reach its target. Coreopsis is self-incompatible and must cross with other seed-grown plants to produce fertile seeds. There are 12 species native to the Southeast. 6 of these are considered garden-worthy, and so their reproductive characteristic is quite important to Southern gardeners. About 5 of our natives have been crossed to provide the plethora of Coreopsis hybrids that you see in the trade. Dwarf larkspur is self-incompatible, and studies have shown that you get much better seed production when the density of the plants is greater. This is real important for this one because with the fragmentation of our landscape, the way it's happened recently, we're getting fewer and fewer blocks of land where some of these species grow, and this is real important for the next one too. In Dutchman's breeches, many of the colonies are self-incompatible, and in the fragmented landscapes, they're too far from neighbors to be cross-pollinated. So there's a decline in the plant's natural occurrence over some of the parts of its range. Purple coneflower is a fun one. Everybody has purple coneflower, I think. In one study of purple coneflowers, one inflorescence, which we might call a flower, but we all know that a purple coneflower is actually many flowers. This one inflorescence that was self-pollinated produced 14 seeds, but outcrosses of the same selection confirmed that it was both male and female fertile and had the potential to produce up to 190 seeds per inflorescence. So big difference between 14 if it's self-pollinated and 190 if it's cross-pollinated. Common boneset is another self-incompatible one. Queen of the Prairie. It's a beautiful plant. I've had a single plant for many years, and I've given away starts of it, but I've only had this single plant, and its increase has been due to its rhizomatous nature. I need to get more plants or find a source for seeds so that I can start getting more plants that aren't just the same genetic, just a clone of the one that I have. Blanket flowers, another one that's self-incompatible. You may notice most of these are in the Asteraceae family. Sunflowers are really interesting. Many sunflowers, especially the Helianthus annuus, which is cultivated and grown for seeds and oil today, it's self-fertile. But originally, most of these sunflowers were incompatible. Or mostly self-incompatible. They also use protandry as a means to avoid self-pollination, but the flower heads of sunflowers are well suited for insect pollination, where you get one insect pollinator there and the flowers are so compacted that it ensures really a maximum number of flowers get pollinated by just a single insect visit. With the protandry and the self-incompatibility, though, most sunflowers are practically self-sterile, even though self-pollination may take place at a late stage if cross-pollination has failed. And I don't quite understand how all of that works, but it's interesting that sunflowers have this complicated process. Heliopsis helianthoides are self-incompatible. Stiff-leaved aster is self-incompatible. I've had one plant for several years, and I recently purchased a couple of more. So far, though, when I've gone out to collect seed, I'm not finding any mature seed. It could be that I planted the plants too far apart, or the timing in the bloom was too different. I have my fingers crossed for next year. I find that gardeners, me especially maybe, are eternal optimists, at least when it comes to next year's plants. You always think, oh, next year, next year. Liatris species, the blazing stars, at least 3 of them that we might see around in gardens. The rough blazing star, prairie blazing star, and dense blazing star are all self-incompatible. The only lily I found in my research that is considered self-incompatible is the Lilium philadelphicum, the wood lily. There are other members of the Liliaceae family that are self-incompatible, but this is the only lily I could find. Enothera fruticosa, narrow-leaved evening primrose, and Missouri evening primrose and prairie sundrops are all considered self-incompatible. I'm sure there are other species of that too that fall in the same category. Wild quinine. Many phlox species are at least partially incompatible, but they readily hybridize, and that can make it difficult to definitively ID individual plants. Most phlox in the trade are propagated by cuttings. So should you purchase a cultivar, if you want to get seeds, you also need to get at least 2 genetically different plants. Rudbeckia fulgida and many other Rudbeckia species are mostly self-incompatible. They do hybridize, and in the trade, there are quite a few of these hybrids. Silphium species are considered self-incompatible in the literature, but I think they must be both self-incompatible and partially self-compatible. I purchased what I thought was a single cup plant, and now I have it growing in a number of locations without planting it there. It's too far for it to be due to its rhizomatous nature, and I'm not aware of any wild or cultivated populations anywhere near me. It could be that my multiple plants are due to a stray seed in the soil from my original purchase, so that now my plants produce viable seed and their birds and who knows who's scattered them everywhere. Goldenrods are self-incompatible, so they must cross with different plants of the same species to produce viable seed. This may be hard to believe, as so many goldenrods spread so profusely by their rhizomes that you'd think it has seeded out. Once they are fertilized and produce seeds, some species may show up in a really wide area. Stokesea plants are moderately self-sterile. So far, my plants are producing only a few mature seeds, but a couple of seed heads from a friend were loaded with mature seeds. Symphotrichium species are self-incompatible and must cross with other plants of the same species to produce viable seed. 2 or more plants are required to produce those fertile seeds. At least 40 genera of Asteraceae have been shown to have a type of self-incompatibility. While individual species are self-incompatible, many species will readily hybridize, cross with other plants, producing new plants with many color, height, and leaf variations. I had Carolina climbing aster for years, and it bloomed wonderfully even into like February. So all winter, starting in like November through February. Then all of a sudden it up and died one year, and it had produced no seedlings. I purchased other plants. Again, I would purchase them one at a time, and no seedlings. Now I have 2 plants of different parentage. Unfortunately, only one of them bloomed this year, so I have to keep my fingers crossed for next year. Most Tradacanthia species are self-incompatible, but they readily hybridize, producing new plants with many variations of height, flower color, leaf length, and leaf width. I have one pink one that I just really, really love. And I get lots of new plants, but I don't get any like that. So if you want to have multiples of the same species of Tradescantia, you need to purchase them, but purchase them from seed-grown plants, not genetically similar to the one that you have already. Anybody who's into blueberries knows that when you go to buy blueberries, as with most vaccinium species, they're partially or completely self-incompatible, which is why they tell you buy at least 2 different varieties. A single plant might produce a few berries, but many, many more will be produced if you have multiple plants with that different parentage. I have a cranberry plant, which has produced fruit for several years now. The question is, for me, are those seed viable? I've planted some this year, and hopefully I'll have my answer before too long. Viburnum species need plants of different genetics to produce a decent quantity of seed. They're for the most part self-incompatible. A nursery owner I recently talked to said that her difficulty was in finding enough seed of the maple leaf viburnum. They just don't seem to produce many. Bird's foot violet is self-incompatible for the most part. You might get some seed set once in a while. Unlike many violets, it does not produce the cleistogamous flowers, which are the self-pollinating flowers that don't open, that most other viola species seem to have. Elderberry, I was looking and looking and looking in the literature to find something about self-incompatibility or compatibility with elderberry, and I couldn't find anything. But what I did find was that they were always suggesting that you obtain multiple plants to produce larger fruit sets. You might get a few fruits on a single plant, but if you want to have large production of fruit, you need to purchase different plants. And so I expect that they may be partially self-incompatible.
Judy, can I ask a question now?
Yes.
Because Nancy said you would take questions in the middle. I'm a little bit confused about this because I have read for a few plants like blueberries and pawpaws that you need not just 2 plants, but 2 different species of plant. So,
not different species, but with different genetic. The parents have to be different.
So as long as they're not clones.
Right.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Which is with pawpaws, like when we did rescues at Randleman Dam years ago, pawpaws were one of the things that we were collecting. But after I got my pawpaw home and planted it and nothing happened, and I started researching this, I figured that probably the plants that I got from Randleman Dam were all part of the same plant, that they spread through rhizomes. And so they were basically clones. Does that make any sense? Okay, I'm not hearing a response, so.
I'm sorry, I had re-unmuted myself. Yes, it makes total sense to me, thank you. And I hadn't thought about the angle of the ones that spread by rhizomes and you dig them up and cut them up, but it's the same plant. So.
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Sure, okay. Now on to some other aspects of plant sexuality. I had no idea about any of this. Lobelia sylvatica and Lobelia spicata are both gynodioecious, and that's probably not the correct pronunciation of that word, but anyway. Some plants bear only female flowers, and some are hermaphroditic. So of course you need multiple plants to ensure good seed set. This is real important for conservation concerns because if you're managing a large area and you have mostly female numbers, your numbers of total population are going to eventually decline. Geranium maculatum, and Nancy turned me on to this. She couldn't remember specifics and I didn't know because my plants had never had any trouble producing seed. But Geranium maculatum is also gynodioecious, but it apparently has 3 kinds of flowers. Some plants are female only. Some are female with a few male with reduced functionality, and some are hermaphroditic. So I've also read that it's protandrous. When you combine all these different morphologies and strategies, it's really amazing that the species even exists. Another important plant trait in plant reproduction occurs in heterostylous species. 2 or 3 morphological types of flowers exist in a population of plants. On each individual plant, all flowers share the same morphology. So it's an important issue with the next 3 species that I'm going to show you. This slide shows you it's not a native plant, but it's really clear to see the difference in those species. It shows the distylic species that has 2 different morphological types of flowers. Notice the height of the anthers and the stigma in each one. You can see it way down in the bottom in one and way up in the top on another. The anthers are down low and then the anthers are way up high. So 2 morphologies. Bluets are self-incompatible, but they also have 2 different flower morphs known as the distyly. Both forms must be located close by for good pollination and fertilization. And off topic again, the image on the right is from Mount Cuba in Delaware. If you ever have a chance to visit, please don't pass it up. Native plants are situated in very naturalistic designs. It's a wonderful place to go walk around. Like bluets, partridge berry is also distylic. Different plants bear their stigmas and anthers at different levels. Individuals that are called thrum have flowers with the style halfway down the corolla tube and the anthers visible at the top of the corolla tube. Pin individuals are just the opposite. Both types of individuals have to be present for successful reproduction. But remember, they're not occurring on the same plant. You have to have a thrum plant and a pin plant.
Judy,
yes.
I'm not sure. Oh, it was just my cursor. I'm sorry, never mind.
Okay, the results of an artificial pollination program have demonstrated in pickerelweed that it has a heterostylous system. But in this case, it's called tristylous. Self-incompatibility is apparently strongest in a short-styled form, slightly weaker in the long-styled form, and much weaker in the mid-styled form. I've had a pickerelweed for many, many years, and I just never really even thought about it producing seeds until maybe the last 2 years, because I do occasionally get new plants. But again, I guess it's a rhizome. I'm not sure what you call it in pond plants. But anyway, I'll get another stalk of bloom from the same plant, but over a distance away. But apparently it's all the same flower. I've never had any seed. So that's something else I need to check into, getting another plant that's genetically different so I can get some seeds. Polygamodioecious, these are special types of monoecious plants the flowers aren't perfect. You have male flowers and you have female flowers. But in this case, both the male and female flowers are on the same plant. I've read that you get better seed production, like for, well, some of the examples, some of the species that do this are birch species, hazelnut species, pines, oaks, and squash. And of course, hazelnuts, you want to get a good crop of hazelnuts. So just like with the blueberries, I've read that seed production is higher when you have multiple varieties of that species planted together. In the slide, you see the separate male and female flowers of a hazelnut on the same branch of the plant. I'd never seen the female flower of a hazelnut. I'm going to have to check that out too.
Judy, can I ask
Yes.
another question? I'm sorry. I don't understand the difference between plain dioecious and polygamodioecious.
Okay. The polygamodioecious they're on the same, let me go back. Let's see. It's separate male and female flowers, but in dioecious plants, they're on separate plants. And
Oh, okay.
Dioecious, they're both on the same plant.
Okay.
You've got male flowers and you've got female flowers. If you think about your pine trees and your oaks, you know, if you've ever seen the different flowers on those, they have two different kinds of flowers because one's male and one's female. Or the squash plants. I know I used to go out and I'd see what looked like it was a baby squash starting to grow on my squash plant. And it would turn out it was just a male flower, and that little looking squash thing would fall off. It was never going to do anything. So in the dioecious, there's distinct male and female flowers, but they're on different plants. And so any offspring are from two different sexed plants. If you have bad allergies, you might think about planting a garden of all females. But keep in mind that the pollen that causes most people's allergies is wind-borne pollen, which travels very long distances. Also, another thing about the dioecious plants, if you're interested in possibly larger blooms, males are sometimes considered to have larger and showier flowers, but then that only applies to the bloom, not to the fruit, and males can't compete when it comes to beautiful fruit because, of course, they don't even produce fruit. Acer rubra can be either dioecious or polygamodioecious. So you might have a maple tree that does not produce seed, or you may have one that does produce seed, which I know when I go visit my brother up in Virginia, I can spend hours and hours picking up seeds and baby maple trees because he's got one that's just prolific. Fringe tree is supposedly one of those species in which the males are showier, but then of course you have to deal with more pollen. And I've never, I don't know, I guess if I saw a male and female next to each other in bloom, I'd probably be able to tell the difference. Supposedly the males have a larger raceme or whatever you would call the flowers on a fringe tree. Persimmons are usually dioecious, but sometimes have both sexes on the same tree. I think this is the case of one at my house. I don't know of another persimmon close to me. I'm looking forward to watching over several years. I did get some fruit this year. Well, I didn't get it, but it had fruit on it this year. All the fruit seemed to be on 2 or 3 branches. They're up too high for me to see, so I might have to get binoculars or something to look at those flowers next year and be able to tell whether they're male or female. Ilex species. In the trade, they always mention male and female hollies, and they tell you, oh, you need one male for every 5 or 6 females or whatever. An interesting thing about those hollies, though, you do need the male, but you can have a male of quite a few different species. And if it blooms at the same time as females of other species of holly, they will often fertilize those flowers. This hybridization between related species of hollies is quite common and has been exploited. You know, you see all kinds of hollies in the trade. Horticulturalists have done crazy, amazing things with hollies. So, Nyssa is usually a dioecious species, but trees frequently have a few perfect flowers. And I think I have discovered that I have a mature female tree. This was an especially great year for seed set in my garden. It was just loaded with fruit. Rue species. I have a winged sumac, which produces unbeatable fall color, but it's a male and I never get to see the gorgeous rusty red stalks of fruit or collect them to make lemonade. Sassafras is difficult to transplant. I've tried it a number of times. I keep trying. I have a neighbor with a male and I would love to get a female that their plant could mess around with. I mean, look at those fruits. That is just gorgeous, that red. Many Thalictrum species are dioecious, with probably the best known one being Thalictrum dioicum. And if you look at that second part of the botanic name, I think that's suggesting that it has male and female flowers, different plants. Sequential hermaphroditism includes plants that change sex at different points in their lifetimes. Probably the one that we all know best is Jack in the Pulpit. Other Eracema species also do some of this. The Jack in the Pulpit changes sex with its size and its stored energy, and it can change back and forth between male and female a number of times over its lifespan. Another species that changes sex is striped maple. They've done some studies out in the mountains, and it appears to change sex when it's sick or damaged. And there have been some interesting things where they've just cut off a branch and kind of stuck that branch in rooting medium or something, and it'll change sex during sometimes just like a 3-week period. It'll change from, I think it's male to female, but I could have that backwards.
Yeah, I think it's female to male because it's typically, sorry, this is Bettina, because typically it takes a lot more resources to be a female to produce the fruit. So
Okay.
typically if there's less resources, it's easier to produce the pollen.
Right. Well, that's with the Jack in the Pulpit. That's why it does it too. So when it's smaller, it's male. And then when it gets big enough, it becomes female. And then it produces seed. And that requires a lot of energy. So it'll usually go back to being male again. So there are also some species that they're finding change sex after fire episodes. So, and I don't know enough about which species. I know there's a euphorbia that does it, but I think there's a fair number of species that do that. And something else I never knew about, lots of species of trees start out as male, and when they mature, they can either retain their male status or they may become female. Many plants engage in third-party sex, like the self-incompatible ones we said, you know, they can't breed with themselves or with a close genetic partner. And in science, the term promiscuity usually refers to a plant's strategies of attracting pollinators. And here we've got a list of some of the pollinators. And also their strategies for attracting those. and it might be pollen, nectar, pheromones, flower form, the age of the flower, the color, and more things, like even on a cardinal flower, at what point in that stalk of the flower they change, the flowers change, like how much nectar and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, it really gets complicated when you get into some of these. So when plants are from different species or genera, they produce offspring. We call them hybrids. Some of the species do this readily, as we've seen a number of them. I've talked about some that do that. And some do not produce such offspring at all, at least not in nature. One thing I can't make up my mind about, but the alum root and the foam flower, we now have these, what is the name for that? Anyway, those don't usually bloom at the same time and don't cross in nature, but horticulturalists have taken those into the greenhouse, and we now have a whole line of plants that are crosses between the heuchera and the tiarellas. Heucherella, that's the name of it. Frequently, hybrids will be sterile and not produce any offspring. In recent years, the topic of hybrids has become sort of a big concern for me and for many conservationists. I have any number of plants that when I collect seeds, I have to just label them as like Vernonia species, because I have several species of Vernonia, and when I collect the seed, I don't know if they're going to be true to one of those parents or if they're a hybrid with characteristics that will be intermediate to the parents. If you live close to a conservation preserve where there are rare species and you plant a close relative, you might be introducing genes that will produce a hybrid that could be the final death knell for that plant species in that preserve. It's just something to think about when you introduce new species to an area. Several species of Trillium are self-compatible, self-incompatible, and sometimes apomictic. Many of us are familiar with the Emily Allen Wildflower Preserve in Winston-Salem. Emily collected Trillium for years, species from around the country. Now, in her garden, her garden is home to some not wild in the natural hybrids, but naturally occurring in her garden hybrids. So when we bring plants from related species, but geographically distant locales into our gardens, it's quite possible that we'll be introducing hybrids into the environment in generations to come. Acer species produce a number of natural hybrids. A chance hybrid seedling is not so unusual amongst Amsonia, because different species of blue star often cross or hybridize. I have 3 different species in my yard. This is the first year I've noticed seeds on a species in my yard that was not from my Tabernet Montana plants. So now I might have to start labeling the seeds I collect as Amsonia species. Although the ones I collected this year, the seed looks quite different. It's much thinner than the ones of the Amsonia Tabernet Montana. So I don't know. I'll have to grow some out and see what happens. Columbine species readily hybridize. So if you want to keep your Eastern Columbine, the one with the beautiful striking red and yellow flowers, you must grow only that Eastern Columbine. Otherwise, you're going to have a variety of different sized plants and bloom colors. And eventually, over time, your Eastern genotype might disappear. So something else just to keep in mind with all this hybridization. There are about 20 species of Baptisias native to the southeast of the US. There are many more hybrids. In our area, Baptisia australis, Sapphira alba, and others seem to readily hybridize. I started with Australis and alba, and now I have plants with pink flowers, lavender flowers, and some to me that look just like the hybrid prairie smoke that's in the trade. Hibiscus are divided into different groups of plants, and plants from the same group readily hybridize. But usually the offspring of those plants are not very healthy. Ones in the trade that you buy are often a complex mixture of different southeastern natives. A number of years ago, I collected seed from my coccinea plant. I just wanted more of those plants, and germinated them. As they started growing, I noticed the leaves weren't true to the coccinea. Of course, I also had one or two other species growing on my property. So it would have been interesting to see what they looked like when they matured, but I didn't keep them, and they probably would not have been healthy. I do have more coccinea plants now because I found that I could divide that plant, but of course they're all clones, so who knows? White oak, this one is amazing. It readily hybridizes. It does it a lot with many other species within the Quercus family, including swamp white oak, bur oak, chinkapin oak, dwarf chinkapin oak, overcup oak, swamp chestnut oak, sandpost oak, chestnut oak, English oak, Durand oak, and post oak. And they usually produce plants with intermediate characteristics. Some of these intermediates have been recognized as varieties, but they're probably actually just hybrids. It would be hard to know though, because there's so many of them. Vernonia species produce plants with intermediate characteristics. It's possible that some plants, again, that are recognized as varieties are like the oaks, probably actually hybrids. If you look at these pictures, the flowers seem fairly similar, but the leaves are very different. Since I have several species, I can't say for sure when I collect seeds if they're maybe Vernonia gigantea, Vernonia novoborensis, or some hybrid. In this image, these Sarracenia species are natural hybrids from a single bog in Alabama. This is another one that when I collect seed from my plants, I have to just label them as Sarracenia species. I'm hoping next year I can pay closer attention to the bloom time, and I'll be able to correctly ID some of the seed I collect if the bloom times don't overlap. I have some seeds I'm growing out right now. Well, hopefully they'll germinate. That I collected because those pitcher plants bloomed later than all my others. So I'm hoping that that means that there was no chance for them to cross with anything else. Okay, my takeaways from this research: if you want to support genetic diversity and inoculate yourself from plant pandemics, every time you add a new plant to your environment, try to add at least 3 plants of that species with differing genetics. 2 of a species might work, but 3 is safer. Plus, it provides a larger visual and other sensory community to attract the pollinators. I think it's good information for gardeners and for the nursery tradespeople to consider when buying and selling plants. Since there's so many plants with all these different characteristics that make seed production problematic, nurseries should be encouraging shoppers to purchase at least 3 of a species and maybe sell groups of 3 that are genetically different and give them a special price for that. If you're a buyer and research your desired plant to see its sexual proclivities, then you'll know whether you need to buy multiples of a plant, or if it's one that once you buy one, you may even rue the day that you ever bought that one plant. So also, if you're interested in the purity of your plant species, limit yourself to species that either will not hybridize or species that within a given genus do not have the same bloom period. Questions that have arisen in my mind during this adventure, some of the questions, there's many more. Are species that spread widely through rhizomes more likely to be self-incompatible than others? What's involved in the process when a species changes sex from year to year over longer spans of time? Is there a relationship between reproductive strategies and ease of hybridization? Is there any way to know in advance if a hybrid plant will be sterile? Thank you for accompanying me on this trip tonight. I'm not a photographer, so thanks to those whose images I've used for educational purposes, especially to Bettina Darvaux, and I hope I'm saying your name right, Bettina, and Nancy Adamson. Special thanks also to Nancy and my sons Drew and Eric for their computer expertise. And I can attempt to answer any other questions if you didn't ask them earlier. And I hope you realize, if nothing else tonight, that you are amazed by all the varying morphology and strategies involved in plant reproduction. It's astonishing that many of these species survive and thrive. I mean, I just can't believe it, how complicated it can all get. So thank you very much.
You talked about the nursery trade a little bit, Judy, and my understanding is that most of the plants in the nursery trade are clones, right?
Exactly.
So you're not getting any genetic diversity at all. Now, occasionally you'll see plant delights mention that they are seed grown. Occasionally you'll see that, and then you're getting some diversity, although a lot of their seed grown ones are hybrids.
Right.
So that doesn't help, but
You've got to hunt down the native plant nurseries, and more of them grow from seed than your other nurseries, your more commercial nurseries.
Yeah, unless it's a specific varietal name, then it's a clone. But yeah, I think Ian Caton does quite a bit of his from seed, I believe.
I think so too.
But some of the others, I'm not sure. Woodlanders, I think most of theirs are clones.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's sad, and we need to, I mean, I know some people push clones because you can get that really specific, one that's great for fall color or whatever, but I just worry about us maintaining our genetic diversity, which we need for a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, Judy, another quick question. For plants that are or have, I'm not sure how to say it, Apomixis, how do you have any genetic variety if the plant doesn't need any fertilization to produce viable seed?
Okay, in ones that are strictly apomictic, you don't get genetic diversity, but a lot of the plants that produce mostly by Apomixis will also occasionally do, like they flower, and they will occasionally produce seed-bearing, flowers that will pollinate each other and produce seed. But otherwise they're just genetically all the same. And so any mutations that happen have to happen not through sexuality, but otherwise. And then that could be possibly passed on.
I can add a little bit just to the serviceberry. That has quite a complicated diploid, haploid story, the Amelanchier group. But, since it flowers so early, sometimes there just aren't pollinators that can be relied upon. So that's part of the reason probably it has multiple strategies.
Right, and this is Bettina. If I can add something else too to that, is it has to do with the stability of the environment. As you can see, these plants are doing a lot of different strategies to ensuring that you're getting cross-pollination. So you want to maximize your diversity because you have your genetic diversity because you have a diversity of habitats and conditions. And, you know, obviously plants, once they're in the ground there, they don't typically move very much. So if you have, you know, the following season, you have a drought, or the next season, you have a wet season, that, you know, that plant that maybe when it first grew, it was adapted to it was used to the wet conditions. Now the following year, it's not, it's dry. So there is an advantage if your environment is stable to not have a lot of genetic variability, because the plants are adapted to that one condition. And if that condition, that environment doesn't change much, then it's actually advantageous to have not a lot of diversity. So it's kind of a trade-off, but the majority of plants do want to, you know, or do cross-pollinate, because you do want to maximize the diversity, because the environments and the habitats are changing readily. So
especially with our climate change coming, who knows what's going to happen?
yeah.
Well, on that note in particular, I feel like we should be thinking about bringing genetics in from south and east of us, just for the survival of some of the species, because those are more adapted to heat and than the local ones are. So I wonder if that's not, you know, not advantageous to actually preserving some of the species, to bring in genetics of plants that are used to a warmer climate.
It is a consideration. I used to limit myself to species that grew within like a 50-mile radius of my house, but I'm changing that now because, in part, well, sometimes it's just plant lust, but sometimes it is due to that fact that I'm understanding that as we warm, you know, I may lose some of the species that require the more northern climate, but I can introduce some that will do better because they're more used to that southern climate. So, you know, I think you're right. We all need to consider those things.